Hello, Tribe. We're back here today with Edge Weapons and Martial Arts and Self-Defense instructor Tim Anderson. Tim, how are you doing today?
Yeah, pretty good. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming in loud and clear. Tim, so we're very happy to have you on, and today we're going to be talking about your experience in the Edge Weapons community. You're one of the people that is lucky enough to have been, well-trained by some great instructors in both the Eastern and Western blade traditions.
Thank you.
Go ahead and tell us a little bit about your training background.
Well, most of it is, began about 94. I started in, I guess it was still called JKD Concepts back then. My ex-wife was stationed in Little Creek down in Virginia Beach, down that way. And they had two gentlemen down there. One is Frank Cucci, who started Lynx Academy down there, and another guy, Pat Trey, was there with him. And I started in the JKD Concepts with him in probably early 94, maybe late 94, because I was there about 9 months. Now, we had done some Edge Weapons a little bit, which was more how the JKD stuff is, which is more the Filipino. But most of the stuff I did with him was more of the Thai and some of that stuff. And then we moved to Maine. And up there's a gentleman out of Rhode Island, Professor Tom Sotis, who's been running a mock since, I think, 92. But I met up with him in August of 95. And that's when I really began, the knife and that type of edge weapons training. And I've been with him since then. I've had some other good instructors. JKD-wise, I was with Mike Krifka for a few years in Maryland, who was one of Guru Dan's guys out this way on the East Coast, and did a little bit more of the tie and stick training with him. But like I said, I've been sticking around with the edge weapons and knife with a mock. Western stuff, I've been dealing with, as far as the tomahawk and the Bowie and a little bit of the kukri, I've been with Dwight McLemore for a few years. A buddy of mine, Steve Huff, introduced me to him back in summer of 2001, I believe it was. Because I just had met my buddy Steve Huff there in Maryland. We ran to school together and stuff and did training. And knife-wise, most of the stuff I learned or saw with Colonel McLemore was more of Hawk. That's who a lot of their stuff was. And so for me, it was just a little bit different. But I stuck with what I did because of how I didn't want to change systems much. Because a lot of times each different system has different blocking, different stuff when it comes to edge weapons. And when you get something you want to stick with, you kind of move in that direction because you don't want to play around with it too much. But it's Western-wise, that's pretty much what I've done. I'm working with the Falcutta. I found that to be I love that weapon. It's great, just like the kukri. But for me, I don't do a whole lot of history studying like my buddy Steve, Doc, and some of these other guys, even Keith Jennings and some of the others. I'm more of I like to know how a weapon fights. Because if I'm going to carry it, the history's fun to know, but it's not going to do me a bit of good if I'm holding something and I don't know how to use it.
Now, Tim,
so, yeah,
no pun intended here.
Sure.
But in the United States, you can't shake a stick in the knife community without hitting a Filipino martial artist. And,
it's hard. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and Filipino martial arts are great. I mean, there's a lot of great instructors, a lot of great systems out there. And I think the audience, for the most part, will probably be more familiar with the Filipino martial arts. Sure. From your perspective, training in the Western arts, I know you've done a lot of training with Dwight McLemore, and I know you've done some training with James Loriega.
Yes.
In the Spanish knife systems.
Oh, I better mention him. He might come up down here and hunt me. I better be careful. I love James to death.
Yeah, he's crafty.
He's a real good friend.
Got to be careful.
That's right.
Yes, but I had started out. I think as most people in the U.S., when you start getting interested in knife work, everybody, for the most part, starts out in Filipino martial arts. It's
relevant.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's very relevant. It's very accessible to people. And when I started to learn about, the Western schools of knife work, it was a real eye-opener for me because the tactics are slightly different. I know a lot of it based on just the historical context of where these arts were developed, creates a different evolution. What are some of the things that you've learned just from your personal experience, your personal preference, that you've been able to take away from Western blade work that you feel, has either improved, your Filipino knife game or just in and of itself is of inherent value to you?
Oh, a lot of the stuff from like even the tomahawk and the bowie. I mean, I guess that's still considered a Western. Yeah, thing. And even with the kukri stuff, I can use all of those the same way I would use a bolo or a kris or any of those weapons. They all swing the same. It's just, having to make it more work for me as far as combative. And that's the way I always tell my friends in the Western, I can take anything you do practically and make it combative. You just have to, with modern stuff, you got to deal with the laws of your state, the laws of your county, the laws of the U.S. You have to be careful with certain things. But other than that, no, I can draw a lot, especially with tomahawk and bowie and the movements with that, especially translating it to empty hand if I want to. Because it's the same principle with putting my knife down. Or opposite, because we train blade and then the empty hand deal from that as compared to training empty hands first and then saying the weapon's an extension of the hand. That's the only kind of opposite that I can draw upon too. There's a lot of Western stuff, they treat the weapon, from what I understand, as they treat it as an extension, kind of like Eastern does, but at the same time, you see the motions with the dagger, you see the motions with stuff, and it seems like they're trying to be more proactive or more offensive than defensive, similar to what the Filipinos did. I think they may have got that from Spanish in the aspects of when the Spanish took over, and I guess they were there like 400 years in the northern and middle aspects, and also a lot of that stuff I draw, like with the Navaja. I mean, look, people go, well, it looks Filipino a little bit the way it swings and moves, but really, it's kind of a reversal thing because they were there so long. So, in my opinion, when countries interact like that so much, each of them influence one another, whether it's Eastern or Western. So, yeah, to me to be able to draw upon Western is easy. And I think it's just as relevant, just as good. I tell all my friends that try to come up with these things about, you go to these places where they do rapier, they do footwork is footwork. Environment is environment. And so for me, to be able to draw upon that is just as easy. So that's why I kind of, I laugh sometimes when I hear guys talk about Filipino stuff or saying one's better than the other and stuff like that. I don't get into that game as much. So for me, I like to draw, like you said, I draw what works for me. It may not work for somebody else, but some of that footwork works for me. Again, it might not work for somebody else, but it works for me, so I use it. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think you hit on a good point that it's not about one being better than the other. They're different evolutions, and I think in the best case scenario, I think training in the Eastern and Western blade arts, you find a lot of things that complement each other.
Yeah.
And I want to get your thoughts on this. One of the things that, one of the ways that, in my mind at least, that I've always kind of divided things, the Southeast Asian arts, the Kali, the Silat, some of the Kun Tao, it feels like they've got a wonderful close game. And one of the things I learned in the Western arts I think complemented that was, I feel from my personal training that the Western arts have a little bit more focus on that outside range and a little bit more focus on that distance. But I think that they complement each other really well, because if you don't train one and not the other, you don't want to be one-dimensional, and I think that can help a lot. And what have you,
exactly,
especially with the Bowie and the Navaja, how do you view the way that the footwork is used from the Western perspective and distance, as opposed to how it's used in the Filipino martial arts?
For me, most all Filipino stuff that I've dealt with deals with your weapon hand being forward. They always want the knife forward, unless you're dealing with a double blade or double stick, that kind of a thing. So then it doesn't matter really as far as that, because if you're southpaw, you can stand how you want to. Usually dealing with the blade, in the Filipino aspect, they want that weapon hand forward. Western is kind of an either or thing, it seems like. Like with the Navaja and stuff, we've always had the Mediterranean grip, where they hold it up and then it's back toward your hip and your right leg is back. So what I do is, I'll combine a couple of those things, and I do, and it's not something I made up, but I'll use what I call, and it's usually called a false lead, where I'm standing with my left leg forward, but I also have my hips twisted and my right hand and all as if my blade is still forward. So it's out farther. So it gives me distance, gives me an extra step. You know, that's the, you know, for me, that's one of the big things I can draw upon. I can take the footwork, the stances and stuff and interact them and move with them and make it easy.
Now, Tim, what about, you know, techniques are great, and techniques are a starting point for anybody training, and you got to have, you know, techniques to get started, kind of like learn the alphabet of a system. One of the things that I've found is, you know, now that I have a decent foundation in techniques, what really catches my attention talking to different instructors, learning from new people, is their tactics and the game plan. And the game plan in Western arts, which are, you know, primarily based on fencing, you know, Western fencing of different sorts, many different sorts, and some of the Filipino arts. But there's a different, from my view, there's a different game plan in place, and the tactics are different. What are your thoughts on the way that those two approaches look at their tactics in combat?
For me, I guess it depends on where you're at in the European and the Western, because the countries and cultures, I guess, were a little bit different compared to Southeast Asian cultures. Most of the Southeast Asians seem to kind of rely on one thing. But if you go throughout the Western aspect, you see different tactics, different strategy, different, you know, those things. And I guess I don't know if it's indigenous or if it's a flavor of how they, you know, fought so many wars and fought over a period of time. So for me, you know, I see a lot of that, and that's why I like when you see the Copus and the falcata, which is more of an Iberian Spanish weapon, or the Copus, you see Alexander the Great carried everything everywhere. And you see that flavor that he spread, and then you look at a lot of different martial arts, whether it's Western or Eastern, and you see some of the aspects of what they did with the, like pancration. I got buddies of mine that do a lot of pancration. And, you know, a lot of those guys like to brag and say they're the world's oldest martial art, you know. But to me, every culture, every indigenous population has had its own self-defense or its own whatever it relies on to protect itself. So for me, but the Western flavor of the tactics and strategy, to me, just dealt with, you look at how they prepare for war. You look at how they prepare for things, battles. They sit down amongst each other to, you know, the generals and whoever, and how they're going to go out and take over something, how they're going to go out and conquer. And they follow that game plan, and it's usually pretty successful. I mean, you watch them, those guys fighting those battles with those swords, and they are very, very, very successful, very accurate, very powerful, and very well trained. And that's what I always like from me when I look at Western martial arts. I see how the training aspect is, you know, but for me, those strategy and tactics are just like it's like instilled. So if you're in, it seems like they bring that same flavor to the empty hands or one-on-one situation. You know, if you're protecting something, not being out just in a battle of 2,000 soldiers going at it, you might be in the castle or in wherever, and you're defending small sections. So you don't need to worry about 2,000 men. You may need to worry about one or two. And they bring that same tactical manner to what they do. And that's beyond impressive. And a lot of people don't either understand or know that. But, you know, they always think of one thing. But a lot of Western martial arts don't. They think of, you know, again, when I go back to environment, they think of where they're at. They think of where they're going and what they're doing. So whether they're protecting the castle, the village, or just going out to fight to protect or conquer, the tactics and strategies seem to just flow with them.
Now, Tim, what about training methodology? And from where I'm sitting, you look at pretty much any martial art in the world or any combat system, you're talking about fundamentals and then drills and then some free sparring.
Right.
What has been your experience, you know, with East versus West as far as how the training is focused? Is it focused more on fundamentals in the Southeast Asian arts? Is it focused more on drills? How about compared to the Western arts?
That's what my Filipino buddies and all are going to shoot me, but to me, I think there's just, with the Southeast Asian, the Filipino, and even the Kali and stuff, even the, you know, Silat, stuff like that, there's a lot and I understand maybe from their perspective, but there's a lot of drills. I mean, a lot of drills, and that's how they train their fundamentals. But to me, I like it. It's fun, and you can learn certain things from it. But, you know, with the Western stuff, they fight more with it. So as they train and you see things, they're fighting more with it because they're preparing to fight all the time, as compared to doing 50 million drills or one-step type things with the blade and stuff. The Western, that's the one thing I can say it's a little bit different. I do like the approach because, you know, we were always taught, you go back to the military or the law enforcement stuff in the academy, the one thing they talk about is, you know, you fight like you train, regardless. And so my main focus and understanding for me is if I drill all the time, then, you know, that's what's going to come out in fighting if I'm not careful. I'm not a big muscle memory guy. I believe more in like what doctors and stuff call like a neurological training, you know, or a neurological response. Your body reacts to how it trains. It has nothing to do with your muscles memorizing anything or that. It's almost like the riding the bike theory. You know, it's going to come out in combat. If I do a lot of drills and things, I may pick up something the wrong way as compared to sparring. So the one thing we've done with the blade over the last 10 or 15 years more of is the reversal of, and it's adopted a little bit more from the Western approach, and that's an opinion, is the aspect of sparring. Professor Sotis even started years ago telling us, you ain't got but 15 minutes to do class, spar. Because you have to be able to know that what you do technique-wise or what you do can at least work in real time. Because if it can't work in real time, then you got to go back and do the training aspect as far as your technique, your training, your drills. You have to work on what's going to make that work in real time to be able to understand if it's going to work for you or not. So sparring is a very, very aspect that we teach and deal with, whether it's free flow, whether it's full out sparring, whether I'm telling people, okay, all you can do is stand right here and move in this spot. The other person gets to do what they want to because I see something you might need to work on or, you know, practice this stuff. And then we go back to the training aspect and work on something that will allow you to, I may feed something at you while we're flowing. And I may feed something every now and then because I kept hitting you, you know, in your left chest with a strike. And so I'm going to work that until you learn a way to prevent me from doing that. And then we'll go back to sparring and see if it works. So it's kind of a reverse engineering thing. And I got that from Amok. Some of the best in the world at that. So for me, that's part of the Western aspect that I like because they train sparring more. They hit more. They do more of what they're going to do. Similar to what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys do. You know, they roll more. Not just drilling stuff, they roll constantly. That's how you get better. It's the same principle shooting a basketball, throwing a football. The only way you're going to get better is to do it. So for me, that's what I draw from the Western aspect is they do more than just stand in a line and train a bunch of stuff, if that makes sense.
Definitely. There's a difference in the two cultures, in the Western knife culture and the Eastern knife culture. And I want to get your thoughts on this because I think it does have a lot of relevance to, you know, how the student is going to learn. For the most part, you know, the Eastern traditions are live traditions. And when I say live, I mean that they've never died out. They've never gone out of use. There's always been somebody learning it from, you know, the generation prior, you know, direct transmission. With, you know, some of the classical fencing that does exist still in the West, but for a lot of the work that, you know, the HEMA community is doing, you know, the historical martial arts community,
sure,
a lot of the systems, a lot of the weapons, a lot of the approaches are being resurrected from, you know, old manuals, old plates, different types of, you know, historical records. And there haven't been, you know, live traditions passed from one person to the other in, you know, many, many generations. Are there any challenges that you see to, you know, instructors that are doing, that are research-based, that are starting to resurrect, you know, a system that had once, you know, died out and they're bringing it back? You know, are they missing out on any kind of key components because they don't have somebody that they can go ask and say, like, hey, you know, how did your teacher do it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, like that's kind of a perfect thing because, like, when you deal with the Bowie and the Tomahawk, there's really no written system anywhere. And if I'm understanding what, you know, I just learned from the colonel correctly, there really never was like a school you could go to and learn to fight with a Tomahawk or a Bowie. It was just, the way they interpreted the weapon and interpreted the historical aspects of reading from manuals, reading from these fights and stuff. And that's a hard thing to have to deal with. That's why I used to kind of go on some of these forums years ago and watch things, and just I couldn't understand why people were saying, well, this can't be this way, this can't be this way, when there was really no written system for those types of weapons. And, and I see the colonel and them, like I said, using their interpretation, which to me is some of the best interpretation I've seen of these weapons and stuff. But they're, looking at the aspects of how, like for Tomahawk, how the, American frontier man lived and what he was doing in his daily life and how that Tomahawk would be used along with that long knife that he carried with him, or even the one shot, pistol or whatever. I'm not a real big gun guy. I love them, but I'm just never fooled with them so much. So I can't talk about something I don't know a lot about, but I do see him and others, trying to train and use those things. So for me, I think that the Eastern stuff, mostly with the Filipino and stuff in Sea Light, was handed down from family to family. They didn't write a lot of things down. Like, for example, have you ever heard of Kali Lustrisimo?
Yes.
All right, well, that was never a written system. I watched film footage of Edgar Salite, gentleman that came to our school years ago and taught, Christopher Ricketts. I don't know if you ever heard his name or not. He passed away a few years ago. And some others. And when we're watching this, I'm watching this late 70s old man with tattoos all over the place and no shirt on. And he's stick sparring with Edgar Salite. And you could see the frustration of putting on Salite because he couldn't hit this old man. Now, he might not have been trying, but you could tell he was really trying to get some shots in, and he couldn't do anything. And then there was all these people standing around him. Some of the names I don't want to pronounce it, I can't really remember. But these guys were writing down what Tai Tung was doing. And that's how that system became a written down system. Because the Lustrisimo had to be watched because he claims he never did anything twice. So once he did something, he said it was always hard to repeat it because he never did it. So to write systems down, a lot of the southern Filipino stuff didn't have like a traditional writing. People watched each other, and that's how it was handed down. And the Lustrisimo gave these men and all permission to do a lot of these things with the angles of attack and things like that, and wrote it down. But you get to Cebu, you get farther north, a lot of these systems began to be written down and taught. And I think that's for me, I believe that's more of a Spanish influence. There is a book out there I recommend anybody to read and look at. It's called Cebuano Eskrima. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Some people aren't going to like it because it's written from a point of view, and the gentleman, doctor, I can't remember his name, claims that during the 400-year Spanish, when they were taken over, there was really not this stuff that you hear. They weren't allowed to brandish weapons, so they did this. He believes, and he says he's built through archaeology, that the Spanish and the Filipinos worked together, and that the Spanish taught the Filipinos some of the aspect of, I guess, the fencing and all, and that's where some of the footwork comes in with the triangles, the Spanish circle, and then vice versa. Some of the Filipinos taught the Eskrima to some of the Spanish. And the theory behind it is because if you take a place over, you don't want to dominate them because eventually they're going to uprise. And so the theory behind this guy is that the fact they taught each other so they could protect, for the Spanish, they could protect these homes, so they gave them everything, and then vice versa. Now, like I said, he claims, he can prove that through archaeology, but it's the same principles. So these systems are transferring between one another, but it seems like the Western aspect seems to, like you said, died out for some reason. I don't know if it's because of modern technology with guns and things like that as far as how war progressed as compared to the Philippines and Southeast Asia. They're more of mostly third world country aspects. They can't advance as far as certain aspects. So the fighting, I believe, had to go between families, had to be taught, and it may not have been written down, but like you said, it was handed down from generation to generation. And we saw some of that when we were training over in the Philippines. You can see families. I'm sorry I'm long-winded, but I do apologize. But with those aspects, and we were told it's the same way in Indonesia. You'll see these families because they're poor. We're sitting on church rooftops in parks at night watching families do a screamer. They're just playing with sticks, but they're not learning to fight. They have no money, so they do this together, as a family. Now, they're learning to protect themselves and stuff like that, but as a family unit, they're doing this stuff that's been handed down from grandpa or great-grandpa or whoever. And so for me, I think that may have a reason that it followed so much. And also, I apologize for being long. I hope it made sense.
No, don't apologize. We want you to talk. That's why we have you on today. So now, let me ask you, Tim, you spent time in the United States military. You were a Master at Arms.
Yeah, I was in the reserves for 8 years.
Now, I managed to anger a lot of people with an article I wrote a while back about military knife fighting. And in my article, I basically argued that, military knife fighting was not the end-all and be-all. It was not this, secret holy grail.
It's awful.
Yeah.
It's awful.
Yeah, and that for the most part, anybody in the military with good blade training has been bringing in outside instructors.
Yeah, I did that for a year and a half even before I was in the military. I was at Pax River, Maryland. I did some stuff for a guy down there. Yeah, military knife. If you go to Applegate and some of these others, well, I know people worship the ground. Some of these guys walk in, and that's great because they were pioneers. But the other thing is, too, you can't, like the old saying, you can't give the arm and let it get cut 1,000 times while you wait to give one strike. And that's basically the old military method. You'd have your forearm out in front of you, and you try to take a cut on the back of the wrist so you could stab somebody. But a good knife guy just stabs you and steps back. Or he stabs you and knocks that arm out the way and slits your throat. I mean, I don't pick on the military aspect, but the knife stuff isn't really that good, traditional-wise.
Yeah. I think the one... I think the one exception on my personal, favorites list is the Stars and Biddle knife system. But tell me about your time, because you did train and teach knife work to the military. What kind of things were you teaching them? What were the needs that you had for the training? Because I'm sure you tailored your training to what the servicemen needed. Tell me about that. What was that experience like for you?
Well, in 2000. I can't remember. He won a Master at Arms, but we dealt with the cadre. Wish I could remember his name, but I met him. We started doing some nice stuff, and I get to tailor the moves because at that time I was still heavy with Professor Sodas, and I brought a lot of the mock training that we used, and I brought it to the Pax River and was using it on the beach right there. Stuff. And we had a different set of attack system then. Everybody likes to use the word angles of attack, stuff like that. But, we did a traditional, but the 1 through 5 always looked the same. And so I kind of brought that same flavor with it. I translated the Bowie to the big knife they use in the military. Or I translated from the tomahawk to the hatchet that they carry to build tents and do things with. Because you never know when something can happen, and that's all you have. Unfortunately, people don't understand it's not hard to run out of bullets out in the field when you're running around. So you have to be able to rely on other weapons. So what we did is we brought that flavor of knife work to the military aspect and brought the empty hand aspect of it. Because you've got to be able to protect yourself if you've dropped and somebody else has a weapon like it coming at you, whether it's a hatchet, crowbar, knife. Because most encounters you run into aren't going to be, even in the military, aren't going to be really knife on knife. You may run out of something. You might have to try to get in on somebody that's got a gun or somebody that's picked up something and is coming at you with a stick or, like I said, a crowbar, and you got to be able to adapt and adjust. And if you can't do that, then you've lost a big step. So with the military, we train the aspect of it that you have to survive no matter what. There's no such thing as a 21-foot rule. There's no such thing as a safe distance. None of that. The only safe distance we deal with in the military is when your opponent or your enemy is out. And I know that's rude and not liked by some people, but I'm sorry, I'm not a crunchy granola person. If somebody is trying to kill you, you've got to survive, whether it's either, out on the street or in the military. But the military is a little bit different because you have to train to kill. You have to be able to turn that switch on, because a lot of people in the late 90s, after the first Gulf War and all that stuff, they went back to that, I'm going for college. It don't work that way. You're a soldier before you are anything. But it's hard for kids to understand that. And most people that join the military, 19, 20, 18, are kids. And I can say that now because I'll be 50, so to me, they're still kids. But that mindset, like you were talking about earlier, they have to be able to put that on, because you can't rely on mommy in the field or call somebody on your cell phone to come help you out. It's it don't work that way. So when we do the training with the blade, at that mindset's there. You have to be able to turn that switch, because if you can't turn that switch, your enemy's got that switch, and we still see it every day now with I'm not mentioning any groups or any of that kind of stuff, because I'm not going to start any kind of trouble, but people are getting blown up and killed all over the world. Regardless of what anybody thinks about it, it's happening. You can't just stop it overnight, but you got to understand that it's happening instead of putting it on the back burner as if it's not. And that's what gets people a lot of trouble. And military-wise, you have to be able to bring that to the forefront of your training. That's the first and foremost thing, that you're protecting not just your family, but you're willing to die for your country. But at the same time, you don't want to die, if that makes any sense. You just have to be able to switch that mindset. So we bring that with the blade. So it's a little bit more aggressive. We do that with civilians, and I have, but some civilians don't want to be hit. They want to learn to hit, but they don't want to get into a lot of the aggression training. Military, you have to bring it, especially with the blade. You can shoot somebody from 1,000 yards away. You shoot somebody 20 yards away, but to stab them and cut with them and fight with them, that's close up, and that's a whole different mindset than being able to pull a trigger and doing it from a distance. And that's something I'll always. It's going to be hard to change my mind on. A blade is it is in close, it is personal. Even if you're using the end of a gun with the spear on the end of it, that is still, it's personal. And, if the enemy is willing to do that, as they've been for the last 15 years or so, and don't mind even putting it up on YouTube, you have to be able to match that aggression. And so for military, you have to be able to do that, especially with blade training. So what we do is, as far as I've changed the actual numbering system, and I do that a little bit different. I'd love to be able to show you one day if I come out there the way the number, people like to call it a numbering system. We've changed it a little bit to make it more of a fight mode instead of that aspect. Okay, I'm going to get you to see me in number 1, and I'm going to work on a disarm, or I'm going to work on I'm going to work on defanging a snake or wrapping arm. You got to get into the offensive mindset. And I'd like for, civilian people to do that, but it's difficult. So, but with the military, it's a little bit easier, but you have to train that aggression. You have to be able to deal with it, and you have to be able to put that into your system. Even if you're teaching empty hands, I've seen it with, the Marines have their karate program and the military program, and it's pretty decent. It's not bad. I don't believe in giving somebody a black belt in 8 months, but I guess if it makes them feel better, that's good. But when it comes to the blade, you have to have that aggression in the military, and you have to bring that to the table. So when we train, and we do that, even back then, even before I got in, the sparring, that was something we heavily did. But back then, we were dumb enough to spar with metal. We were dumb in the 90s. That was stupid. I don't recommend that anymore. But we trained with aluminum back then, and that's how you get out of training a little bit, because you damage a finger or damage a wrist, you can't train. So we kind of eased up on that. We use knock trainers a lot now and stuff. I don't know if you ever heard of those. They're out of Thailand, but we use more of that aspect, but we still hit. So that's a good thing about those types of trainers. I can still hit you with that training, you'll still feel it. Shock knives are fun, and they were fun with the military, but the difference being is the fact the shock knife is not real. You're not going to feel it. If you get cut with a good blade, I don't care if it's dull, I don't care if it's sharp, when that thing goes through you, especially when you're going at it, you don't feel it. Now, I've had little nicks and cuts and didn't even know I had them until later in the afternoon. You don't feel it. And it's the only difference that I have when I see people train with shock knives, whether it's police department or military. Shock knives just shock you, and then that's good because you feel the pain. But you have to understand, in a blade situation, you may not feel it. And that slice could be right to your gut if it's a big bowie, if it's a big knife. So, but again, for me, military, you have to train that aggression. You have to not just drill technique. You have to fight with it.
Now, Tim, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because I've had a lot of conversations with friends in the community, and a lot of the guys that come under that banner of the modern combatives or street self-defense, and a lot of times sparring is frowned on. And, the argument that I get and the logic I get is, well, in the street, you're not going to duel with somebody. In the street, you're not going to, spar with somebody. You got to get in there fast. You got to, hurt them quickly, take them down. And my response to that was, you know what, I kind of think of that kind of knife training sort of like the old-fashioned kind of one-step, self-defense techniques.
Yep.
And you can get really good at those. And I tell them, I said, you can get really good at those self-defense techniques, but now go try and do it to a Golden Gloves boxer.
Yeah.
And let's see how.
In the face.
Yeah. And I think that the reason is, even though, yes, you may not, duel with somebody on the battlefield or in the street
right.
in an alley, but I think that there's so many things that come from just sparring. The attribute development, understanding, real distance, time. So I think that that's something that, and I'm really happy to hear you talk about that, because I think it's kind of a false logic to think that.
It is a false logic. You can't learn a system without sparring. I'm not even going to mention the name, but I was watching a tape one time. The colonel got me to watch. And I'm sitting there looking at this tape, and I'm listening to this person say, you can't learn anything in knife sparring. It's impossible, da-da-da, you can't. Next tape series from the same individual, everything known to man, they're sparring like crazy with these Bowies. And I'm like, wait a minute, just your last 3 volume sets, you said you can't learn anything sparring, but now you're sparring and talking this, that, and the other. I'm like, I looked at the colonel, I didn't want to say that because I just had met him. I'm like, what made this guy change like this? I mean, and I guess he didn't want to hint joke, but he said it sounded more like DVD sales than it did anything. But no, and I'll argue that with anybody. I don't care. Sparring is everything, because then you know how you get hit and you know how you hit back. You can do, and I don't disagree with the other combatives aspect of training either. You train those things because you got to get in and out. Professor Sotis and Guru David Gould say the same thing when it deals with a knife. If you do get into a knife-on-knife situation, which is rare, I know people don't like to hear that either, but again, I'll revert to the fact that most of the time that you're having to pull your blade or defend and get your blade, somebody's got another weapon. It's usually not knife-on-knife. But the technique, the mindset and everything should still be the same. But with the sparring aspect, at least you know that, okay, you can spar with different weapons like that if you want to, and you can still move around. You can still get hit. You can still hit back. You know if it works in real time or close to it. With the combative aspect of it that people do, that's great, because you got to know you can take a hit. You got to know you can be able to do things. But you're not going to go through a gauntlet. I see these videos of people walking through 5 or 6 people, and they're just trying to beat the snot out of them while they're doing this, and then they'll do 20 burpees and jump up and do the same thing. I got news for you. That's not real at all. That is not real at all. I'll tell it to the toughest man on earth while he's beating my ass. I don't care. That is not reality. But it teaches you that aggression mindset we talk about. That teaches you about being hit and all that kind of stuff. But you can't teach people that that's fighting. And you can't teach people that you're going to learn technique in fighting from that. That doesn't work that way. The closest I've seen, and I think people don't want to give credit, but back in the late 70s, early 80s, Tony Blauer was the one that started all this stuff. And he did it, and I thought it was great because I was watching videos of them driving around in vans, and the students signed papers, and they were attacking the students. They jump them in the bathroom. They jump them on the side of a Chinese restaurant. Now, they didn't jump them to beat them up, but what they were practicing and learning was their version of scenario training. That, to me, is a little bit better than doing 20 burpees and punching a bag and then doing, little drills or that, because you don't know if that's, Tony Blau and him attacking you or not. It's more likely it probably is. But the way they did their version, I think a lot of people don't want to give credit, because I think that's where they got a lot of that from, was the Chu Fin Do that he did back in the 70s and 80s like that, where they would sit still, and if a guy wanted to punch you, he just tried to punch you. Your job was to not get punched. They didn't care if they were holding a conversation in a coffee shop. They didn't care if you were riding down the street. So to me, that's a little bit more brutal, but that's how a fight really takes place. You make somebody mad, they're going to swing at you. You sleep with somebody's wife and you get caught, that man may want to kill you. And that's how reality begins to take place. Not a gauntlet, not any of those things. Now, I'm not picking and saying I dislike the way modern combatives train because I think they're some of the best athletes in the world. But you still have to be able to spar. You still have. What MMA fighter doesn't spar? I mean, think about it. If they didn't spar or do their stuff, they wouldn't be getting in the ring 8 weeks later to fight each other. And when I trained stand up for guys, I'm not a grappler. You know, these guys went full contact. The only thing you didn't do is you couldn't elbow and certain knees because you can't get injured before fighting. An elbow will just that you can end a career with an elbow to an eye by accident. So, but you still had to be hit. You still had to be hit hard because if you get into a ring or you get into a fight and you're hit hard, you get shell shocked. So you have to spar. You have to do these things. And sparring to me, especially with a blade, is everything. You have to be able to move with that blade. Your footwork and all is great, but footwork might not do you any good out in Chicago in January if there's ice all over the place. But if you can't hit somebody, you know, or excuse me, I take it back, if you can hit somebody, you can hit somebody falling down and stay in the fight. But if you worry about your footwork and you flying up in the air falling down and your mindset has got you out of the game because your footwork didn't work or that strike didn't work, then you're done with. So, no, to me, sparring is practically everything with blade. Excellent.
Now, Tim, let me talk to you a little bit about another aspect of your career. You are, you know, you've had a career in law enforcement.
And yeah, brief, but yeah, I got hurt in 2005. I still stayed on to about 2007. And that was 4 years I worked at Capitol Police.
Okay. Now, 9 out of 10 police officers that I know, and I have a lot of police officers in my circle of friends, some of my students, the majority of police officers that I've interacted with carry knives.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's at least 9 out of 10. And what I found interesting was that if you ask them, you know, what's your agency's policy on the knives, there is no policy.
No.
They don't want you to carry them, and if they do allow you to carry them, there's virtually and usually no training with the knives.
No, that's terrible. Now, Capitol had a little bit of training. I didn't participate or do it. We had a guy with a, I can't remember his name, he was a real nice guy. And I think his instructor is actually kind of known, but he's from a karate aspect from, what is it, like I took 12 years of Aikido and Hapkido and all. That's more of your, the word has left me now. But what do they call those arts?
Like the Korean arts, or?
Well, no, not the Korean, the type of art. I mean, like Aikido.
Like Aiki, the Aiki arts?
Yeah, Aiki. He comes from an Aiki-jitsu background. And, you know, for me, I didn't like some of the stuff that the knife was done with Aikido and some of the Aiki-jitsu stuff because it's more based on a Japanese sword. You know, and that's why you see the overhand strikes that Aikido does, or most Aikido does, and stuff like that, instead of a good regular punch or a good regular, you know, thing like that. So, but you know, for me, excuse me, it's just the law enforcement don't get it, and then when they do, they get this military type stuff, or they get this other aspect. And they don't get enough training. You go to the range 2 or 3 times a year. You have to qualify. You have to be able to shoot a specific number or whatever at that target. I hated that because I shot things when it moved better than standing still. But with a knife, you never got that. And I wish I could have worked more with my buddy down at Pax River because we were working on trying to transition a folder to be able to legally be, you know, used in the military or law enforcement or whatever to transition to begin as an impact weapon, you know, because you can use it, fold it up, and hit with it. You can pinch. There's a lot you can do with that thing closed that it's not lethal force right away. And then transition to the lethal force if it's open.
Now, do you advocate the use of knives for police officers? Do you believe that that's a tool that they should have access to?
Oh, yeah. The knife is the equalizer. Everybody wants to go to the gun, and I know 2 or 3 guys that I've seen that can transition to a gun better than anybody in the world. In fact, one of our instructors at the range in Capitol was like 4th in the world at this type of shooting he did. He was freaking awesome. But that's the rare occasion. I only teach 21-foot rules to civilians. I let people talk about it and all. To me, there is no safe distance. I don't care. If you got a blade in your hand and you got a gun and you're within, I don't care, feet, you're still a danger to me. And I'm not going to get into that mindset again where, okay, he's 22 feet away, I'm good, let me pull my gun and shoot, or whatever. I don't care. If you have a weapon and you're within my vicinity, you are a threat, period. I don't care. I got 4 kids. I got a wife. Those type of things. I'm not dealing with that. Even when I was a cop, or even now, especially with diabetes and stuff like that, and there's certain things I can't do anymore, I'm not taking chances. So if you're within the vicinity, you are a threat. I don't teach law enforcement 21-foot rule. I don't teach military 21-foot rule. If they want to do it, that's fine, but I don't teach it. I don't advocate it, and I think it's a bunch of crap.
Nice. Now, Tim, before we go,
sure,
please tell the audience where they can reach out to you. If somebody's interested in getting you out to their school to teach a seminar, to teach a 2-day camp, how can people reach out to you and find you?
I'll spell it out right now. My phone number is 434-509-9918. You can call me day or night. I don't care what time it is. Text. I'll be more than happy to talk with you. I have a Facebook page, but I don't get to check it as much. It's Infinity Blade Concepts, and Concepts is with a K. Infinity is spelled like the car. That's the easiest way I can put it. I'm not very tech savvy like a lot of my friends and stuff with computers. I go on Facebook. If I'm not mistaken, I think my Facebook page is just Tim Anderson, where I'm here in Lynchburg, Virginia. I'll go anywhere. I love to teach. I don't have a chip on my shoulder. That's the easiest way to put it. I love to teach. The only thing I ask is somebody cover my flight. I'll come out and teach. I'm not very expensive, and I give 20% back to the school or whoever hosts. That hopefully helps cover some of the costs and stuff for their generosity to let me come out.
That sounds like an excellent deal and an excellent opportunity to get with, an instructor that has trained with some incredible people and offers some really great classes. So, Tim, thank you again very much for being on the show with us. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we can get you back soon to talk about some other topics. All right, thank you.
Anytime.